Bueno, gracias. Esa sesión fue bastante emocionante, creo, y buena forma de empezar el día. Las señoras están aquí con nosotros, espero hoy todo el día. Vamos a cambiar al inglés para la próxima sesión, así que si necesitan audífonos, por favor. Vamos a entrar en un tema... Switching to English. We are getting into a topic now after this very interesting session that is quite technical. It's very, very relevant for the topic at hand. And we are very, very honored because we could say we have one of the top worldwide experts right now, come on, we can say that, who has recently published lots of studies on data management and information management systems for social protection. Very, very interesting set of tools, of guidance, materials. So we will be happy to share. Her name is Valentina Barca, and she works for Oxford Policy Management. She's also part of the researcher team for the regional study, joined this effort with us and Rodolfo. We're very happy to have her, and we hope to have a presentation, but also prepare questions, because I think it's a unique opportunity to engage with her on data management and how is the official title? Registros sociales y gestión de información para un sistema más reactivo. Let me see in English the official one, sorry. Social Registry and Data Management for Shock Responsive Social Protection. Welcome, Valentina Barca. Thank you.
Bueno. Me dieron la sesión más difícil después de estas testimonianzas de doña Nori y doña Consuelo. Gracias para esto. Quiero empezar disculpándome porque no voy a hablar en español, no quiero avergonzarme públicamente, voy a hablar en inglés. Si después tienen preguntas, si entiende español le puedo hablar, pero para hacer la presentación no, gracias. También quiero disculparme, I'll start speaking English now, because I am not an expert from the region. I was involved in the latest phases of this study that my colleague Rodolfo has been leading together with my other colleague Ana Solarzano. But where am I supposed to point this? Here. Well, I can keep on speaking. What I do bring to this study, as Francesco was saying, is I've been working a lot on the topics of data and information management for social protection, with working for DFAT on a project which includes case studies from Chile, from Brazil, as well as other countries. And I've been involved in OPM's global shock responsive social protection study, which includes case studies, none from the region, but case studies from Pakistan, from the Philippines, from Mozambique, Lesotho, Mali, and the Sahel. And these are all available online if you want to have a look. So I'm going to try and bring some of those global experiences to try and understand how the context of okay, so if you go to the next slide. This is the first project I mentioned. If you click, there's a lot of clicks. I'll probably need, should I stand there? I could do it from here. Okay. Okay, no. So these are the two projects I was just mentioning, and down here is another project that I've recently been working for with headquarters at the World Food Programme, including with our colleague Sarah Lawton, on the potential role of digital ID for social protection programs. The picture I put up there at the top right corner is you could say this is a pretty nerdy topic, talking about data and information management, and what I'd like to say is that it's actually an incredibly political topic, and it's basically information systems are human systems, and ultimately they are there to respond to the needs that we have as policymakers, as people who work in the field of social protection, in order to better deliver policies for the people that are affected, for example, in the case of a crisis. So let's keep this in mind. Often people they hear the words data and information management and they run away. But we all need to be able to understand this topic in order to embrace it and actually see where we can go with it. So what I'm going to be talking about today, I'm going to give you just a bit of context on what social registries are and where we are at in the region. I'm going to talk about a conceptual framework which will help us to understand the extent to which these social registries can or cannot be useful in the context of emergencies. I'll be providing some examples, and I don't like calling them recommendations, but they're lessons that are emerging from the global experience, and drawing some conclusions. Yes?
I want to really ask you to just slow down.
Slow down. Okay, I'll do that. Thank you very much. So, social registries. This is a map just based on available data that I collected, that the World Bank has also collected in a recent publication by Leite and other people. And as you can see, the region is basically all blue, and I might even be mistaken. Those countries, Venezuela and others, may also have a social registry. I just don't have the data. So what is this social registry? I'm sure all of you know. Basically, it's a database of potential beneficiaries of social assistance. And the way it is different from other program level registries is that it's a registry that's where data is collected at national level, and included in this social registry, which often includes socioeconomic data on potential beneficiaries of social protection. This data is then filtered using some form of an algorithm. It depends on the country and it depends on the potential user programs, how this formula is allocated to determine eligibility for different programs, and that data is then given out to different programs. This is different from approaches which happen sometimes in other parts of the world, where data is collected by individual programs and then integrated into an integrated beneficiary registry. I'm slightly using typified examples here. Of course, most registries in the region don't exactly fall into this category, and there's lots of variations, and we'll be looking at this further on. I'd like to talk about one important variation, which are registries which, rather than collecting data from scratch, they're integrating data from existing administrative databases, including the National ID database or civil registries. And so basically what they're doing is they're reducing the burden of data collection from beneficiaries. And this existing data could, for example, already be used without any additional data collection for categorical universal programs. This is the case for ANSES in Argentina, but especially for poverty-targeted programs, some additional form of data collection will be necessary for that data to be used for social programs. Of course, even countries that don't have social registries all countries manage their data on their social protection programs using some form of a database and some form of a management information system that helps to manage that data. So there's always these two components, the database or registry, these words are interchangeable, and the software application that helps to manage that data and link that data, and we'll be looking at that further. So Rodolfo yesterday talked about the role of pre-positioning data for shock-responsive social protection. So in the case of vertical expansion, we've talked about the potential to use existing program databases to deliver additional assistance or a longer period of assistance to those same people who are already receiving. For horizontal expansion, there is the potential to expand to people who are already in an existing social registry. So people who have already been registered, there is the potential to piggyback on that. And for piggybacking, there is also, again, the potential of using existing databases rather than collecting data from scratch. And the advantages are quite obvious in terms of timeliness of the response and reduction of duplication. But in terms of impact, in terms of usefulness, is this really a good idea? And this is something I know that countries in the region have been grappling with a lot. I also wanted to remind you that from even the dimensions of system preparedness, existing data also has a role to play. So for targeting, it can help us to swiftly identify potentially those in need. For delivery, it could enable us to swiftly deliver because we already have their details, for example, and we can deliver much faster to people whose information we already have rather than collecting it again. And for coordination and financing, yesterday we had a good example from Sistema where one of the key objectives was to take evidence-informed decision-making. So the data that a social registry has can be incredibly useful for that evidence-informed decision-making, kind of to prepare and then in response to disasters. Now, the problem is, as I was saying, that I offered at the beginning that very simple visual of data collection, then the data goes into a database and the data is used, but it's not as simple as that, and there's huge amounts of variations in how social registries are operationalized that impact how useful they can be for their own purposes and in the context of an emergency. So let's just look at some of these, and then I'll be making examples further down in the presentation. So how data is collected and updated. This varies hugely across countries. Some countries they do a national census survey every 2 years, every 5 years, every 10 years, it depends on the country. Some countries have on-demand data collection approaches. Some countries are integrating data from existing databases, as we saw, and the implications of these different approaches are huge in terms of how up-to-date the data is and a few other variables. What percentage of population is covered? No social registry is identical to the other, and it's very rare for these social registries to actually have 100% coverage of population, and I think Uruguay is an exception to that. We'll look at that later. Whose data is collected and stored? Are we just collecting and storing data just on beneficiaries? Some countries, for example, they don't digitally store data on non-beneficiaries. Are we including just citizens or also migrants, for example? So that the people whose data we're collecting and storing will hugely affect how useful the data is in response to an emergency. What data is being collected? What types of variables? Are we just, for example, if we're using that data to try and identify the chronically poor, it's probable that the number of variables will be much higher. We'll be looking at indicators on assets and other types of vulnerability that will help us to then establish who can receive or cannot receive a poverty-targeted benefit. But some categorical programs don't have those huge data requirements. So a social pension has much lower data requirements. And similarly, not all, I'll actually look at this later. Then what other data sources are being integrated? And that's not just data, that's the example of the virtual social registry that I showed you before. How data is validated, stored, and managed. Is it accessible, for example, at different levels of administration, at lower levels of administration, especially in decentralized contexts? Who is responsible for data collection and management? We know that there's a lot of power that goes with ownership of data, and data in wrong hands can have big implications. The level of data security and privacy that's guaranteed, we've just in the last 6, 7 months, there's been lots of examples of major breaches of this type of data in several countries, including the US and Estonia, which is considered one of the maximum examples of data protection of its citizens. And the data sharing agreements and protocols, including with external actors and researchers, universities, NGOs, WFP, and how that impacts then the use of the data in an emergency. The different types of shocks also have a big impact on whether existing data can or cannot be relevant. So a natural disaster versus an economic shock, for example, will have an impact on how localized data we need, or whether it's actually affecting an entire population, the speed of onset of the disaster, and the level of match between existing data focus on poverty, chronic poverty, and transitory vulnerabilities. Similarly, recurrent shocks like the droughts that we heard about yesterday in Guatemala have implications in terms of how much we can prepare our data to then be used in the case of an emergency versus one-off shocks that are quite difficult to predict in advance. And same with the size of the shock. If a very small number of households is being affected, then new data collection is not a big cost. But if large, vast segments of populations are affected, maybe using existing systems, existing data is more effective. So what I'm going to look at now is just a framework to think about this, think about using existing data for social protection in the context of a shock response. And it's built on research that I've done for DFID and for DFAT on this topic. And it's work in progress. So if you have any feedback, any examples, if you have anything that you don't agree with, then please come and speak to me afterwards. So we define data quality as data that are fit for use by users. And here we're talking about government or humanitarian actors that are involved in emergency preparedness and response. Now there's a problem here, that data was originally collected for another purpose. So that data was supposed to be used for standard social protection provision. So is that data still of good quality when we're talking about responding to a disaster? That's the question we're trying to answer. And we're going to do that by looking at these various dimensions of relevance, completeness, currency, accessibility, and accuracy. So this picture you saw yesterday already in a different variation. So it's the mapping of the different databases versus 100% of population. So you've got your social registry and your beneficiary registry and a potential shock, and those three areas A, B, and C as Rodolfo showed you yesterday. Now in terms of relevance, data is relevant if it's suitable for its intended purpose. So how do these databases compare against each other in terms of relevance? Now, social registry data, if it is stored and maintained, and in Latin America, you're far ahead on this compared to any other region in the world, because very often data on non-beneficiaries is not stored and maintained digitally. But where it is, it doesn't necessarily contain a full set of operationally relevant variables. What do I mean by operationally relevant? Data that you could use the day after, 24 hours later, to actually respond to an emergency and deliver payments to people. So because that data is actually not being used to deliver specific programs, it doesn't necessarily contain those variables, bank account details, potentially biometrics, very detailed contact information, name of a principal recipient and an alternate recipient. These people have been registered, but they have not been enrolled. They haven't gone through that second stage of data collection. Data on beneficiaries, on the other hand, is much more relevant. It's got all those operationally relevant variables, but it's inherently linked to that smaller and often targeted group. So the extent to which the data is relevant depends on how the underlying programs have been designed. So in the Philippines, for example, WFP supported government to give money to beneficiaries of the Pantawid program in the aftermath of Typhoon Haiyan. And these beneficiaries were women with children under a certain age. It was a conditional cash transfer. The conditionality was waived, but this target group was still very limited. And WFP and UNICEF as well, they ended up supporting all the remaining beneficiaries through different channels. So the groups that are actually included in that hypothetical beneficiary database, which could actually include several different databases, will depend on the user programs. And we need to remember that these existing programs most often focus on chronic poverty and not resilience. So they're often missing those additional variables, which we've talked about the importance of all those people that are on the verge of being poor. They're vulnerable to shocks along their life cycle, and especially in situations of emergency. So what's experiences are coming from the world on this? One approach has been in Kenya to collect operationally relevant information for all registered households. So in Kenya, they have, in these areas which are cyclically affected by drought, the Hunger Safety Net program has collected operationally relevant data on every single person living in the region, including opening bank accounts for these people, so that when a weather index gets triggered, these people can receive their cash instantly. That operationally relevant data is available. And of course, there's the EVAC experience here in the region, which we heard about yesterday. And Pakistan is also doing something similar with including climate smart indicators in its national socioeconomic registry that can be used to assess vulnerability and not just chronic poverty. On completeness, so coverage, we talk about the number of records compared with a full set of records, so 100% coverage. So again, we've got our same picture, and it's very rare for that subset of beneficiaries to be 100% of population. So that's only the case in Alaska, where they have a truly universal basic income, but very few countries have that to that extent. But it's also true that across different databases of beneficiaries, not just of social assistance, but also of social insurance, that coverage can increase quite dramatically. So we need to think about not just that social assistance cash transfer, CCT type of database, but also other databases. And that's something that Argentina has done, for example. The social registry, its completeness depends completely on its approach to data collection and to data management. So just to give you a snapshot from the region, here we've got Uruguay with 100% coverage. In fact, they have more than 100% coverage, partly because they retain data on people living abroad and people who have died. Then we've got this group in the middle, Colombia, Chile, República Dominicana, who they arrive kind of between 70 and 80% coverage. And at the top we have examples from Brazil and from Mexico. What's interesting here is that these levels of coverage depend on political decisions in the background. So in the case of Uruguay, they use a data integration approach. They integrate data from existing administrative databases, civil registry, and that's how they reach that 100% coverage. República Dominicana, Chile, and Colombia, they combine on-demand and census survey type of approaches, while at the top, Brazil and Mexico primarily use on-demand data collection approaches. And what I wanted to show you here, just incredibly briefly, is just some pros and cons, strengths and weaknesses of the on-demand versus the census survey approach. So while the on-demand lowers total costs because of that self-selection of people into the registry, and it has that dynamic ongoing entry which is essential for any life cycle approach to poverty reduction. And it builds administrative capacity. A lot of you have registration which happens through local municipalities, and that's built a lot of capacity. But it has potential risks in terms of the most excluded, the most vulnerable not accessing because of stigma, illiteracy, lack of communication, and a whole lot of other problems. It requires large network of staff at local levels that I know other regions are very jealous of Latin America from this perspective because they don't have that type of capacity. And one interesting one I wanted to say is that it's not easy to get GIS locations for households if you're doing an on-demand approach. And that GIS data is one of those variables that for shock response can be incredibly useful. The census survey, it potentially can reach the most marginalized more effectively. It lowers the marginal registry costs. It enables you to check the household conditions when you're going to the household, but the risk is you have a static and inflexible registry. So we heard from Pakistan, they've succeeded in covering 85% of their population through a census survey, but they're also experimenting now with on-demand approaches, partly because of these challenges. And this re-registration, it's very often postponed. So on average around the world, it's been about 6 to 7 years, while there's evidence from Costa Rica that ideally the re-registration should happen every 2 to 3 years. Partly because we know that people are churning in and out of poverty, especially if these are supposed to serve poverty-targeted programs. Okay, so what are the options kind of to increase coverage, especially kind of for the purpose of shock response? So potentially expanding coverage up to 100% in those areas that we know are very likely to be affected. So any country kind of which is in the route of a cyclone, or areas which are very prone to floods, we could be expanding coverage to 100% in those specific geographic areas. This is something that Kenya has done with the Hunger Safety Net program, Bangladesh has done, and several other countries have been doing. In general, preemptively mapping coverage of existing social protection databases versus other types of databases as well. And let's remember that the one with the biggest coverage by definition, well, depending on the country, are the civil registries and national ID databases. So there's potential to use those as well. And in general, having a very clear strategy for other affected households that are not in the existing databases, that we will need a strategy for those households no matter what. In terms of the currency of the data, i.e. how up-to-date it is, it's impossible to have data from an existing registry that tells you a situation after a disaster. That's obvious. But the main factors that affect the currency we just discussed are the approaches to data collection and the approaches to information management. Again, there's an interesting evidence coming from Pakistan that people tend to trust the BISP database more than the underlying national socioeconomic registry, because the BISP database is running programs all the time. It's keeping its data up to date in order to serve its citizens. Someone changes address, that data is being changed, while the underlying registry is more of a static beast. So that we need to keep that in mind. In terms of accessibility, it's important who the managers and the users are. There's in countries around the world, there's always been more challenges accessing the data when the users are external, for example, NGOs or third parties rather than government, and much more difficulty accessing data from local government levels than, of course, at central level. And these processes and authorization levels, they need to be in place before an emergency occurs. So Argentina's got memorandums of understanding with all of its provinces. Chile has got 345 service agreements with all of its municipalities. These are processes that need to be set in place beforehand if we want the data to be used effectively at all levels of administration. Of course, whether the data is digitized or not will have make a difference, but also what data interfaces are available. Are we talking about web service that you can click a button and have access to anything depending on your user authorization, or are you sending CDs and kind of other types of information management approaches that take much more time and slow down the process? And in the background, these provisions for data security and privacy. So I don't know how many of you have followed the recent crisis in the US with Trump and the DACA database on the Dreamers coming from many countries here in Latin America. That database was created to protect a group of people, and Trump wanted to use that same data against those people in order to identify them. There's many cases of this. There's historical examples from the Holocaust, from the Rwandan genocide, of data being used against the people that data was collected for. There's an interesting study by the IRC in Pakistan, I'm almost done, which showed the importance of these pre-existing memorandums of understanding. So what they did is it's research from Sindh province in Pakistan, and they compared the efficiency of using the data from the National Socioeconomic Registry versus collecting new data from scratch using a community-based targeting approach. And they found that it was about twice more effective to use the existing data from the National Socioeconomic Registry, but there weren't any memorandums of understanding in place, and that process took about 35 days to receive that data in order to respond to that crisis. So it's having those systems already in place that makes a big difference when we're trying to respond to disasters. The last variable, this one of accuracy, what I want to highlight is that there's an objective side to it, and kind of about how the data collection is being undertaken, the tools that we're using. We heard about mobile computers and how that can enhance data quality, whether there's validation and verification checks with the national ID database, and these are objective factors that affect the accuracy and perceived trustworthiness of the data. But there's also subjective factors around how trustworthy other institutions are that are collecting data. In Mali, for example, they're now trying to integrate data that's being collected by a whole load of different actors into this integrated beneficiary registry, but no one trusts each other's data, not to even go into the issue that the variables are very different, but there's big issues with trust of the data collection approaches from other agencies and other actors. So that's something we need to keep in mind. And here I've got just a picture of a fox on a very fancy car. It's a great car, it works, but if we don't trust the driver, there's a problem. To finish, so using existing data, it can reduce duplication and it can improve timeliness. There is evidence of that coming from around the world. And one interesting fact that Rodolfo's research has been showing in the region is that even when data is collected in the aftermath of a crisis in these Registros Únicos de Damnificados, the overlap with the existing databases is actually very high. So 66% in Ecuador, 80% in Peru. So for a very fast response could have been obtained within days of the crisis striking without the need for additional data collection. So there is potential there, but there's a huge political trade-off, and we've heard about that as well. The fact that by definition you will have inclusion errors. So by definition but the question is, what's more important in this type of context, to reach fast and to bring solutions fast versus the potential for some inclusion errors. To close, and this is my last slide, and then we can talk if you manage to stay awake discussing information management, is that basically having a social registry means nothing what we need to be doing as countries is looking at how our registry is operationalized and then understanding how we can tweak, how we can make it work better in this context to respond to the different needs of addressing crises, because it's a very different purpose compared to providing standard social protection assistance to the chronically poor. And that trade-off between timeliness and effectiveness of targeting, we need to keep in mind and make a political decision about that. And also the fact that we shouldn't just be focusing on social assistance. There's other databases out there that can be used in these contexts, and just increasing overall interoperability, data sharing, existing memorandums of understanding, which is what, for example, you've been doing with Sistema. That's a really important first step. So thank you very much. My voice is gone. Maybe I better run away now. Thank you. Thanks.
She can use that one. Okay. Okay, so we're opening up for questions. Oh, down there. Okay, Juliana, de Colombia, per me.
Thank you for the presentation, Valentina. I have a question in the case of massive migrations. You mentioned about data collection in the domestic sense, in national citizens, but in the case of migrants crossing borders, what would you recommend as the best or most suitable instrument for data collection of international migrants or with double citizenship? And the second question would be, what's your take on biometrics, on data collection?
Okay, should I start? So, two touchy topics all in one, thank you. So, I mean, migration, my answer part one is there's that political decision in the background. I mentioned it. Who are you including in your database? Are you including migrants as well? We heard an example from the Caribbean region where many of the people affected were migrants, but they were not included in the underlying social registry, if I'm not mistaken. So these are political decisions that need to be taken and they need to be addressed. And in these contexts, I would say yes, information on these people should also be collected, and on-demand systems will be more responsive to those needs. One second.
Maybe I should be a bit more explicit. I wanted to be a bit diplomatic.
Yes.
But I think you need the more straightforward question. In our case in Colombia, we're getting approximately between hundreds, thousands of Venezuelans or Colombo Venezuelans entering the country. But it's difficult to obtain this data when they cross the border is quite expanded. So in that sense, I would like to know more the type of instrument, the type of questions, more from a technical perspective.
So I think that's the kind of question that we should be discussing later, that level of depth. But what I can say is that there's agencies around the world, including WFP, and countries which have been experimenting with portability of benefits across borders, and with biometric registration actually being a tool to be able to guarantee that right in terms of identification across borders and guaranteeing those rights. But I think that the depth of that question we should probably discuss later, partly because it's political. And I know that many countries, for example, there's an explicit choice not to include migrants, including in their social protection systems, and it really depends on the country. Yes.
Thank you very much, Valentina.
Yes.
We started this conversation, I think, at the airport.
Yes.
And I think we will still continue to do that because I really do not understand. But don't you think... no. Namibia is in the process of learning how to do this, so this was a very good presentation for that purpose. Firstly, I don't think there is a general agreement on what social protection is in a given country. And so I guess the data that you want to gather will depend on
completely
what you understand by social protection in your own country.
Completely.
That's one. I think for us in our part of the world, one of the challenges that we have in terms of exclusion and exclusion has been the question of birth certificates that determines eligibility to get, for example, children's grants. But your birth certificate also determines your ID. And if you don't have an ID to prove how old you are not going to get your pension. So in Namibia, we are starting to discuss the what do you call it? Is it civil registry? To update our civil registry, because in Africa we have got the borders that split families into two.
Yeah.
So on the other side in Angola, you have got people that are claiming they are Namibians. This side they have got uncles and aunts, and so that is a different challenge that we have to deal with, but it's still nevertheless the kind of challenges. But what I'm really trying to understand from you is where we have a fragmented system like we have in Namibia. I'm not even talking about shock responses. I'm still at the core, at the basic issues of how to set up a registry in a country where you have got a fragmented system. So what is the best approach?
Okay, I think, again, that's a question we should talk about more later, but I do want to give you two answers to issues that you've raised. So Kenya, for example, has been shifting recently from a system that integrates data from across all of its individual programs. So it had 5 programs that were integrating data into an integrated beneficiary registry to give an overview of who was receiving what. But each program was collecting data in very different ways, different types of data depending on their needs. And they've now been going through this process to rationalize that data collection across those 5 programs, understand which variables were in common, how to actually kind of do that at national level in a more effective way. And they're shifting to another model, and it completely depends on your needs, on your programs. There's no formula, there's no given answer. You just need to analyze and break it down that way. And you've also raised the really important issue of the importance of the civil registration and national identification as a backbone, especially for interoperability across databases. Now, in sub-Saharan Africa, civil registration on average across countries, Namibia fares better, but it's at 35%. National identification is lower at around 29% on average. Countries here in Latin America are at a very, very different stage. But what I can say is that there are other countries in the world, including Pakistan, including Kenya, that have linked their efforts to increase national identification and civil registration to the delivery of social protection. So, for example, the Kenyan registration camps for social protection programs were giving free and facilitated access to birth registration and national identification as a secondary objective. And in Pakistan, NADRA, the authority which has supported the socioeconomic registry, has used the BISP program as a big push to get women into national identification. So these two things, they can go hand in hand, and there's very powerful links that can be there.
Thank you. One more. I think we'll take 1 or 2 more.
One.
No. Thank you for an excellent presentation. You mentioned
the risks associated with managing data and how it can be used for political means, how it can be used against the very people that we're trying to serve. And we've seen that in many cases. And so and of course the diagram with the fox driving the car is really important, because without that trust, then people don't want to share the data. But in your opinion, what is the best way to prevent that from happening? What is concretely, what kind of legislation? Do we have examples? Practical means to stop that from occurring?
So there's two levels at which that can be addressed, and I think, again, from the first perspective, which is the backing national legislation, Latin America is absolutely ahead compared to the rest of the world. There's very strong underlying legislation on data security and data privacy, and most of the social registries here in the region, they abide by the International Standard Organization 20001, I can't remember which one, but on data privacy security in terms of data storage, data sharing, and kind of those practical technical protocols. Then there's the other aspect, which is of evolving technology, and I think, the most recent cyber attack has been on the social security data in the US, and I'm sure they had fantastic legislation, they had great technical people behind that, but with evolving technology, it's very difficult to know where the next attack is going to come from. And I know that there's people around the world who've been exploring, the new hype is about the use of blockchain in order to try and reduce these risks. I don't feel it's been proved yet, and there's a lot of research that still needs to be done on this, but I know that WFP is also involved in these discussions, so that's important to keep in mind. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any other question? Otherwise we break for coffee. One more. Very interesting chance. Otherwise you can take up, I'm sure, bilaterally with Valentina. Thank you so much. Applauso. Y vamos a break. We're going for coffee break. Para un café, 15-20 minutos y volvemos. Gracias.